Good morning. Today we're going to take a look at the topic food sustainability. We're going to have a specific problem that we're trying to solve, and I'll kind of walk you through kind of like what is the design thinking process like to kind of arrive at a solution. All right, so let's take first a look at like the initial problem statement that we wanted to focus on to kind of explore what the process looked like to then so that we can then later at the later point apply this process that we kind of like understand and kind of like know to any sort of like problem that any kind of like of our customers or potential customers has, in order to arrive at the same quality of solution by having a really solid methodology on arriving at that solution in a very systematic way. All right, so the initial problem statement, or not problem statement, the initial how might we statement that we have is the following. So, how might we help communities access the seasonal produce of their region, fueling fair and honest relationships between producers and customers while ensuring food safety for all? This is our how might we statements. How might we statements in general is a way to rephrase a problem statement or like a problem that you think your customers might have, or your target audience might have, in a way that should foster kind of creative thinking. You can have, even for the same problem, you could have various how might we statements that are very different, that focus on very different aspects of your defined problem. However, they allow you to very much kind of like have very different kind of creative processes or like creative thinking on the same issue, which can be helpful, especially if you think on kind of giving the same problem to multiple teams and having them all come up with very different solutions by having like slightly different how might we statements. All right, so that's kind of like the problem statement, or like the how might we statement we have. Oops, sorry. There you go. Yes, this is the solution that we came up with. So as you can see, the customer is going into the some sort of grocery store where there's various produce on offer. There is a QR code attached to the product that we're trying to kind of like drive sales towards. This QR code should indicate in some way that it will like the obviously the food that it's kind of belongings to, but mostly this is now a QR code that someone will scan using their phone or the app installed on their phone. Could obviously also be just the regular camera app that then links to like a web app or a website. But in general, like they will scan it, and after they scan it, they get the new information that we want them to see. This information that we would want them to see would hopefully be enough of an incentive to actually scan it. Or you can obviously also go in here to like maybe do more research, user research to understand like what would the reward here, or the information, or the like physical reward, like really depends, like what would the incentive have to be here in order for like the customer to actually like take the effort of scanning the food or like the QR code that you're offering. This is something that you would have to explore in a further research to understand what these, like how these actually interact with the user base. All right, but this is where we ended up. So this is a solution that we're presenting to the given problem. And if we go back, we see like so how might we help communities access the seasonal produce of their region, fueling fair and honest relationships between producers and customers while ensuring food safety for all. This is the solution. So we're thinking local produce has like some sort of like attached reward system, or at least some sort of additional interaction that is applied to it, ensuring that this system will help someone make the conscious choice of like purchasing specifically like local produce that has this kind of additional interaction associated with it. Like I said, how exactly and what exactly the rewards or like the incentive has to be for this to work is not something we explored in this case study. but it's obviously something that you should explore before you would turn this into like a full product. So as often we said, more research is needed. Right, so let's take a look at the methodology to just explain like how we how we ended up there. So this one where we start is like the double diamond methodology, meaning we kind of like start with the discover phase, go over to the define phase, then the develop phase, and then the deliver phase, broadly speaking, right? We have always like a divergent, then convergent, divergent, and then we converge again. This is like roughly what you're kind of like is happening. And in the next few slides, I will kind of go over like each of those phases and mention like which kind of like methods we kind of used at each stage. All right, so let's start with the discover stage. So on the discover stage, what we did was we first created a CSD matrix. The CSD matrix is basically a way to define the certainties, suppositions, and doubts that you as an entire team have. Like every single person that's on the team should kind of write down what are their certainties, what do they think about the problem at hand, they know to be true, right? Anything that is relevant for that, for analyzing this how might we statement, any certainties that they're there. Then they also have to do like suppositions, so anything that they're not sure on. And then the last one is the doubts, so things that they are like really unsure on, right? One thing really important here is there will be things here that one team member and another team member will disagree on in terms of like, is this a certainty or not? As soon as anything is ever from something that what someone defined as a certainty, and there is a discussion on the topic, you can immediately move these over to like suppositions or doubts, because these are things that you would then have to explore, so that the certainties are only those things that the team would agree on entirely, so that those things are entirely certain. There is one other aspect that you're doing at this point. You're doing secondary research, meaning you're not doing primary research, which would be like you're actually doing some sort of like research into like how certain people behave and all those kind of things. You actually just look at what other people research already and what they figured out to aggregate this information to that you have a firm understanding on like what research has already been done. And what are the insights that have been gathered throughout, right? This will then obviously inform which of the, maybe some of the doubts or some of the suppositions will be moved onto certainties, which would be great if you could move like most of them into certainties. But some of them will obviously remain in as doubts as well as in as suppositions. And those two things is what some of these, especially the ones that are the most crucial for whatever business we are exploring, are the ones that we will then move forward into our kind of user questionnaires, so that we can possibly like explore more, is this actually the case? Like, is this, or like what exactly, like, so that we can kind of like move doubts into either, or this is not true or true. Same thing with like the suppositions of like, that we can just make those, basically move those into certainties. One thing to keep in mind is like, it's not exactly clear like on what level something would sway anyone on the team on their opinion, but this is in general the process where we could explore certain things. But obviously the best thing would be like typically if there's some sort of research that backs a point, so that we can just move it very easily from a supposition or a doubt into like a certainty. But yes, so this is kind of like the discover phase. The other thing, the one thing that we doing is we're trying to do, you can just kind of summarize some of the information, which we did here. So like if we figure out something out based on our secondary research, let's just cluster it, understand what a secondary research is, what are the key insights from the secondary research, using either like, you know, just the analytical skills, or obviously like using some sort of AI system to help you throughout this process. Ensuring just like that, you know, like how to kind of like put the data in, at what points you kind of put it in. All right, next point is after we have like a clear, like some of our research clustered and identified what are the key issues that are possibly concerned, we then would basically try to understand like what are the key insights from our secondary research, right? And which of those do you want to focus on? All right, so let's go back to that one. That was, so we had our research, we had our 6 key areas of insights that we typically have to cover. In this case, we had like time constraints and conveniences and important topic. The knowledge gaps is an issue. Trust and skepticism in general, remaining doubts, support for local and sustainable practices, desire for simplicity. All these insight is something that we gathered from the secondary research meeting. Like we looked at what other research has been done, and user interviews. User interviews are basically you are trying to kind of create a questionnaire that is very generic, so that there are no leading questions. You're trying to really just gauge what the user thinks and assess that, and then you kind of cluster whatever they said to get like, okay, are there correlations? Is this something that everybody said? Like those kind of things, so that you get a very clear sense of like where everybody, like what the kind of user base is thinking, without actually without trying to affect what they are thinking about and how they're thinking about it by your questionnaires. That's kind of like the skill set that you have to kind of try to develop. One key term here is the kind of affinity matrix, which is basically the process of like trying to aggregate and more like categorize and kind of like understand which kind of clusters of kind of the thinking in your user base or like customer base. And yeah, that's the methodology we use there, or the tool. After you have that, these broad categories, again, you can try to use AI, but be mindful of not accidentally kind of like try to make sure that the data that you're collecting from your users and the questions are in some way connected, or the AI is aware of the question that you used, in ensuring that there is not necessarily the AI doesn't have to figure out which question it was, because you will sometimes have answers from users that are without the context of the question, don't make any sense, or like don't have any sort of like, you could draw the wrong conclusions based on those, right? So make sure that you kind of, if you feed it into an AI system, this is my question and these are the answers I got for the specific questions. If there's follow-up to those answers, that makes it a little bit more tricky, but in general, that's kind of like the, broadly speaking, how you would want to approach it if you feed it into an AI system. All right, so now we have our key insights, where we basically then have to just select based on like what we know about our kind of like target audience, which of those we want to focus on the most in terms of like, these are the things that we want to address possibly. In this case, we did specifically like the time constraints and convenience, the knowledge gaps, as well as trust and skepticism. Those are the three main areas of focus. We want to now go into the define stage and now define specifically what the user that we are trying to address these three areas on looks like. The more specific, the better, so that everybody on the team has a very clear sense of like where we are moving toward and what user we actually are trying to make a product for, what customer kind of like demographic, or in terms of customer persona we're trying to forward. All right, so let's see. Yes, we basically create a persona, which is in this case Sarah, kind of 28, location Berlin, occupation like works a very demanding job. And if you were to ask about the problem statement we had initially, then so the problem statement was, just to remind you, how might we help communities access the seasonal produce of their region, fueling fair and honest relationships between producer and customer while ensuring food safety for all? So that's the problem statement. Now, how would she most likely react if you were to give her, like in general, like, ask about that topic? Then basically you try to summarize into a sentence. In this case, I want to support local farmers, but I don't always have the time to make it happen, right? It puts in there the time constraints. Someone is interested in this, but that is kind of their issue that they're having if they're talking about this problem. All right, so then you try to, now we have a persona, not like very clear defined, right? So now our solution should address this specific persona, like not everything else. We're trying to address this person, or like this specific persona. So now we can actually define like what is the problem statement that we kind of can distill from this based on our how might we statements, as then now we can define like what is the specific problem we should solve for her. All right, so in this case, if we take a look at the next slide, so we have landed on like we have an active professional needs a way in their active lifestyle to find and buy local food. They struggle to find the time to make informed food choices. That's our problem statement. All right, given this problem statement, let me take a look. Yeah, given the problem statement, you now have, you go into the next phase, which is the ideation phase. The ideation phase, for anyone unfamiliar, is basically now where you try to explore as many possible solutions from various angles, and you try to use as many kind of creative problem solving tools that you can think of to ensure that you have like really interesting ideas and kind of consider everything that you kind of like from you based on everything you just done, like to just consider as much as possible. All right. Yeah, let's take a look just briefly at like, you know, some of the kind of like ideation steps so that we kind of use specifically in this project. So Crazy Eights, you know, really like various ideas that are maybe a little bit further out from maybe the solution that you just come up initially. Yeah, and then after you have like, you know, some ideas, you typically try to be like really like the ideas should be easy enough for anyone on the team to understand. So like the more visual you can make them, typically the better, because people can grasp visual ideas a lot better than if you write them as text, right? Also keep in mind that visual ideas will most of the time then kind of like just win based on because people will not be able to keep all the written down ideas in their head unless it's some idea that resonated with them, right? So if you want to make sure that there's a like, just be mindful of that, right? So like if you have different forms of kind of like idea generation or like different ways to present the ideas, some ideas will just not immediately be considered even from the team just based on like how they are presented, right? As the initial kind of like pitch. But obviously like it's an iterative process, and so like you can always go back to ideas, but that's just something to keep in mind, because like take a look at this slide, for instance. It is extremely easy to grasp like the concept on the left as well as the concept to the right, because you see like, okay, there's some screens. Here's already something with like some sort of food truck. Okay, there's gamification. Okay, I can have on a very kind of easy, I understand very simply what it is. While, oh, now I have to read the text to understand, which is like, yes, will people do that? Yes, but it's basically like now you're looking, it's the attention has to be very different. And so like, yeah, just keep in mind on that, right? And if you take a look at our solution, like of all the solutions we had, the one that is like already like visually the most kind of like developed in terms of just like it's easy enough to understand is eventually the one that we ended up. So there is this like, even in our project, the proof of like the ideas that are easy enough for everybody to kind of like latch onto are typically very sticky, right? All right, cool. Now basically then you try to kind of like understand, okay, where and how can these things work. You try to kind of like put it together, use whatever method makes sense to you to kind of like understand, are there kind of like similarities between different solutions? Is there something that we can possibly put together as like a single solution, right? Is there a solution that kind of addresses a lot of these different things? So you kind of try to map it. That's why it's basically like you have certain things that you map from various points, and you're like, okay, I address with this one, I address this part, with this one, I address this part, because no solution will address everything, right? You can also use the value effort matrix to do this, so that you're like, okay, which of the solutions that we have are like low effort, which are high effort, which provide low value and which provide high value. And then you kind of just cluster the solution ideas that you have, and then like depending on your business context, you will then obviously decide like, what is our time frame, what is our scope that we can do, you know, what are our resources, all those things, and then you basically will already somewhat know like which of those makes a lot more sense to do. And so it's clear. In our case, like it was a little bit easier to kind of integrate, but we kind of focus on the low effort, high value, and a little bit also on the kind of like high effort and high value, because they were easy enough and close enough together to kind of integrate, that this should would not necessarily be like as much of an issue. So after you did this part, you now have defined a persona, you discover the problem, define a persona, and now have developed a possible solution that you want to explore. And now it would basically, the deliver stage, just figuring out like what exactly do you have to do. So first you kind of like can use a task flow, and go back. So you have a task flow of like understanding roughly like where and how does someone kind of like, what is the user, the customer journey, right? Like, so understanding like what is happening, right? You can have multiple of these, or you can have one. We obviously just to have one. Someone enters the supermarket, they search for a wanted product, sees a seasonal food section, they scan a QR code next to the product with the native camera app. They then open the browser / the app version, depending if you already have installed the app or not. They check the product benefits and see comparison to normal products. So like what is the incentive to the incentive? Well, like this was the incentivization that we had to make sure that people are actually engaging. And then we check the producer profile maybe and the location to understand like even more about the, you know, behind the scenes of like, oh, this is an interesting farmer that I'm kind of purchasing from, and then put the product in their basket, their physical, like the location where they want to put it, and then they buy the product, or she buys the product. Sarah in this case. All right, so now you have a task flow, and now we would basically, the next step is then like moving this into kind of like the screen designs or like things. We also like at this point is actually where the storyboard first would happen as well, just to make the user task flow extremely clear for everybody. And after that, you would then go into wireframing, right? You can go into like low fidelity at this point, you can go high fidelity or mid fidelity, but most of the time you would go low fidelity. In this case, we did. And if you take a look at like, there's basically like the scanning, the comparison, the data being presented, and then like maybe there are more additional product details that you can see here. Yeah, and then like just to illustrate, like the next part would then be like you could check with your users, and if the user gives some feedback of like, okay, in this screen that is like very basic, but they get people will get the point of the screen by you walking them through it, because in this case it's a low fidelity prototype. You then get the feedback, and then you can possibly like integrate. So like, let's say for instance there's the producer name immediately at the top that you want to use. To just show them more information, like who is exactly the producer, and then you can basically iterate very fast. That's why you do a low fidelity prototype, to understand or like iterate as quickly as possible on the final solution that you want to then, or the final MVP that you want to then invest more time in kind of developing, but essentially like seeing like how the market then reacts. All right, and I think that's pretty much all. Let me just quickly check if there is anything that I have not covered. I don't believe I have. I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, there are obviously then various forms of like user testing that you can do, or like in various, unsupervised, supervised things. But those are like those will then highly depend on like what product you're doing, how you want to do it, and those. Yeah, that's it. Below you will basically find, as I mentioned, I think before, the kind of written out text on like how to typically use the kind of double diamond and this design thinking process together or in conjunction to kind of like develop like MVPs or like, and kind of like understand the product market fit. Those will hope for most businesses, this will be a lot more data driven if possible, because otherwise you do a lot more on just what I think or what certain parts of the members of the team think. And so the general advice there kind of moving forward is always like, as much as possible, have an idea for the business, but make sure that you kind of are using data in your own kind of understanding of like what you want these things to be.